Thank you, Daryl. The program has been a little bit reorganized, as explained by Philip at the previous session. Instead of a 2-hour presentation in the morning, followed by another 2-hour presentation in the afternoon, we have 2 shorter presentations in the morning and 2 shorter presentations in the afternoon. So this makes it necessary to change some of the titles. The title of this particular talk will be the first title in your program, which is the concept of the basis as a tool of warehousing. So remember, we have a primer on the gold and silver bases. As a first definition, a rough one, which can be refined later as we go, but a first definition would be the basis, say the gold basis, is the difference between the nearest future price and the cash price of the gold. As a matter of common experience, the future price is at a premium and the cash price is the lower of the two. This situation is known as Contango. I don't know where this word comes from, but it nicely rhymes with tango, and I use this as obviously tongue-in-cheek. The last Contango in Washington to mean the end of the dollar system, and the last Contango in Washington brings to mind the last tango in Paris. So if you excuse this little pun of mine, I am using it again and again. This is not the first time I've used it. I have given this title to some of my papers and talks elsewhere. But I think it's fitting and it's also to the point. Anyhow, the situation whereby the future price is at a premium is called Contango, and the opposite situation, when the future price is at a discount in comparison with the cash price, is called backwardation. But this is very crude, and to refine the concept, they introduced the basis, and the basis is the actual difference between the Contango price and the cash price if it's positive. So the basis could be positive, and normally it is positive, and if the basis goes to negative, then you have the backwardation, the opposite situation. So the same is for silver, and it's not immediately understandable why this is so important. Because what I'm suggesting it to you is that the basis is the most important single economic indicator which helps you to make prognosis, helps you to anticipate future economic events. And this takes a little bit of thinking and analysis and concentration. And the purpose of this talk is to make that in fact clear. And the surprising answer is that the basis is a kind of measure just how profitable the warehousing business is. But for that we have to go to another example, because the precious metals or monetary metal markets are not really historically the first examples of the basis and basis trading. Historically, this concept was evolving in the grain markets, especially in the American Midwest, where they built huge elevators for the purposes of storing grain. At harvest time, they filled up the elevators, and during the crop year, they brought down the stored grain, so the elevators were empty by the time the next crop was brought in, and when the cycle started again, and it went on year after year. So the futures market in grains developed simultaneously with the grain elevator industry. What happened was that the future markets quoted the future grain price on a monthly basis. For the sake of simplification, for every month of the crop year, there was a contract. It called for delivery of a fixed amount of grain, a certain prescribed quality, at that particular time. So those who were in the grain business, the grain elevator business, they had this problem or facility to get prices not just for the cash grain but for the future grain prices. And the users of grain could provide for their future needs by going to the future market. So this was spreading the grain business on a much wider basis than it was possible before. The number one consideration which we should recognize in this change, this happened towards the last 20-30 years of the 19th century, when organized markets, futures markets arose, and at the same time they made it possible for the grain elevators to build their storage facilities. But the first thing to note is that the capacity of a grain elevator is far too great as far in terms of risks involved. Because if you filled up your grain elevator, the quantity of grain you controlled was so huge that even a small change in the grain price could wipe out your capital, which is represented by the cost of building these elevators. So this is a very good example where you see how capital can be put to work for you. You build these grain elevators, and then you are able to provide the grain demanded by the market throughout the year. But the risk is there, and the risk is magnified, greatly magnified. You have a larger capital, but the capital is no longer sufficient to provide you with insurance against fluctuation in the grain price, because an adverse movement, say a drop in the price of corn, could wipe out your whole capital. That's a real danger, and you need protection for that. And this is exactly what the futures trading does, because futures trading spreads the risk over the whole crop year. And it boils down to the basis. This is what happens. This is a simplified view, obviously has to be, but it does have the grain of truth in it. The beginning of the crop year, just before the new crop is brought in, the elevators are empty. And the basis, I remind you the difference between the future price and the cash price, nearest future price and the cash price, is the widest. It's the maximum. Now, as the grain elevator operator fills up his bins with grain, the future, rather the basis, is at this highest point. During the crop year, the basis has a tendency to fall, and it will reach the minimum, which could be backwardation as well, that is to say negative basis, at the end of the crop year when the grain elevators are out of grain, ready for the new crop to move in. So there is this annual cycle from minimum to maximum at the beginning of the year, and then a gradual fall of the basis to the end of the crop year when the cycle repeats itself. So this is the course of the basis. Of course, there will be variations, there will be movements depending on different influencing factors, but it's important to see the large picture, which is just this cyclical movement. We can also describe this using the language of cost of warehousing, because obviously the cost of warehousing will be the highest when the elevators are full. So any extra space which you may need is at a premium. And then as the crop year goes on, more and more elevator space becomes available, so the cost of warehouse space comes down until it reaches its minimum at the end of the year when the grain elevators are practically empty. So this gives us a good conceptual grasp of the basis. You might identify the basis with the cost of warehousing space, in this case elevator space for the grain. And the basis is the widest, means elevator space is most expensive, and then it becomes cheaper and cheaper. By the end of the crop year, it is the lowest level when it starts the cycle again. Now, why are we talking about grains when we are really interested in gold and silver? We are talking about grains because this is the beginning of the story. The grain trading was a problem which they solved long before the storing of precious metals by the individual came into vogue, and this had to do with the crisis of the monetary system, which developed, as you probably know. We can go back to the 19th century, in particular the Civil War period in the United States, and then World War II, and World War I first and World War II on the other, made the monetary crisis deeper and deeper until we reached present day situation when it is exploding in our face. So what you would like to see here and you would like to understand is that the need for warehousing precious metals, and my preferred word is monetary metals, the need for warehousing them arose over a period of time. First, you could take the monetary system for granted. The promises of banks and governments to pay you gold on demand were sacrosanct, and nobody would question their validity. And then later on, you found out that first weaker governments, but then later on even the stronger ones, or even the very strongest ones, defaulted on their promises. So if you wanted to hedge against that, if you wanted to be secure that you have access to real money in all situations, then you had to solve the problem of warehousing monetary metals yourself, because you no longer trusted the banks, no longer trusted the promises of governments. As I say, this developed over a period of a century or longer, but it did dawn, ultimately did dawn on the people that promises are not what they pretend to be. The promises are there to fool people, and governments declared bankruptcy fraudulently more often than they declared bankruptcy with a good reason, because when Britain defaulted on its gold promises in 1931, this was a fraudulent default. The Bank of England did have gold to continue paying, and the United States defaulted on its promises to pay gold domestically in 1933. That was the very first proclamation of the new President Roosevelt. And in 1971, this was the coup de grace, the last effort which succeeded in killing the gold standard. The United States government defaulted on its international gold obligations. So this was a long process, taking longer than a full century, and the conclusion which individuals who are thinking ahead had to make is, how do we provide for warehousing monetary metal on our own, out of our own resources, without relying on banks and government promises? And there was already a model, that was the grain market. That's why I started explaining a little bit about grain trading and the grain market, and how it developed the concept of bases, and how the bases had this cyclical pattern, and how it can be interpreted in terms of the cost of warehousing. You see, because when you wanted to solve the problem, if you like, hoarding gold and silver, providing for money for difficult times when the monetary system may even collapse, then you will obviously have to go back to first principles, and you find these first principles in the grain trading. So that's the explanation, and that's why I am suggesting it to you. If you're interested in this problem, then you should study, you should take time and look at the grain trading and its various patterns. I will have occasion to point out the differences. Right now I am concentrating on the similarities. The basic similarity has to do with the problem of warehousing, which does arise in the grain market, from the fact that there's one crop a year, which has to be distributed over the crop year, so that there will be grain available throughout the crop year at a reasonable price. I mean, just imagine if you didn't have that rather delicate mechanism of the elevators plus the futures market for grain, then the price would have to take on the burden of clearing the market. So the grain price would be hugely depressed at harvest time when there was all this excess grain available. Nobody wanted it because there's far more grain than you would need for your current consumption. But by the end of the crop year, it would be at the other end of the stick. There would be a tremendous shortage, and people would bid up the grain price to unreasonable heights. So that would certainly not be conducive to social peace and so on, if the price had to do the adjustment for you of the variation in the quantities of grain in warehouses and the demand for immediate consumption. So this was truly a wonderful development, as I say, going back to the 19th century. Even though at that time nobody thought that we could ever face the problem of the same problem as far as monetary metals were concerned, because it's very difficult today to explain how firm the belief of the ordinary people was in the promises of the banks and the government in those days. The gold standard was sacrosanct. Nobody in his right mind would question that a self-respecting government would ever default on a promise to pay gold for banknotes or bonds or what have you. And then we lived to see that the promises of the government were of a lower level than the promises of crooks among themselves, because the governments never meant in the first place to live up to those commitments when they made the promises. So this is how the basis comes in. We have this warehousing problem. We realize that for the sake of our own survival and for the welfare and comfort and safety of our beloved ones, our spouses, our children, their interest in getting a good education later in life, and also providing for our old age when we have the weaknesses going with old age and we are more exposed to sickness and need more health care, more medicine and so on. We want to provide for those needs. Then the question comes up, can we trust the insurance company for this coverage, or can we trust the government promises in promising Medicare, various other coverages, or are we better off if we just take our future security into our own hands and provide for our own insurance? And in many cases, especially in time of a crisis like we have now, the answer is you are better off if you provide for your own old age, for the education of your children. And the best way of doing this is through warehousing or hoarding monetary metals. Now, of course, that's a very broad-brushed answer, but there are more refinements, and we just have to work it out to see in what proportion these monetary metals, gold and silver, should enter the equation, and what percentage of our resources should be invested in these monetary metals, and should we trade or we should just accumulate. And there are any number of questions you could ask, and of course that is what we try to do, develop a model which is useful for most people of modest means. Of course, a very wealthy individual would solve these problems slightly differently. So we have now this problem, and the solution we seek is through the basis which is a kind of cost-benefit analysis when you zero in on the monetary metals. Obviously, if the cost is too high, you may reduce your provision, but if the cost of warehousing varies, then you might want to take advantage of incremental savings or incremental investment in monetary metals, taking those times when the cost of warehousing is the lowest, then you buy. And if you want to sell as well, in other words, you want to magnify your profits, you may consider selling as well. Then obviously selling will be at the time when warehousing is the highest. Now, most people just don't go through this analysis, and therefore you have a head start, because you are not buying gold or silver indiscriminately, or when you can afford that you buy. No, you wait for the opportunity when and it's not the price which is your guiding star, it's the basis which is your guiding star, because that determines the cost of warehousing. And you buy when it's the lowest, and you sell when it's the highest. I just want to put in a word about selling, because selling may not be an appropriate market option for people of modest means, and I count myself among them. I'm living on a pension, and I am acutely aware that my pension may go down to zero in value. I'm not enjoying this prospect, but I have to be realistic enough to see that what happened to my father's generation and what happened to my grandfather's generation could happen to my own generation. My grandfather was a pensioner at the end of World War I, and his pension was worth zero at one point after the war. My father was a pensioner at the time of or after World War II, and exactly the same thing happened. And this explains, at least partially, why I have become interested in this problem. I don't want the same thing to happen to me. Now, if in North America, I don't know about Australia, but if in North America you say that, look, this is what happened to my grandfather, this is what happened to my father, I don't want it to happen to me, they would say, it would never ever happen in America. What an absurd thing to assume that a pension could go down to zero in value, or your social security would become worthless, or your Medicare, or this or that. After all, the people paying taxes are still out there, and they are going to pay taxes to get our benefits. And I mean, this is the kind of mentality. And I'm sorry, I just don't take it. I think the mindset is such that we just have to change that. We have to get used to the idea that these catastrophes do happen. They happen in Europe after lost wars, but they also happen without any reference to any war anywhere, because in the Great Depression of the 1930s, there was no war involved, yet pension funds went bankrupt and stopped paying pensions. And even some of those who did not lose their jobs, and I'm in particular referring to university professors, and I was deeply interested in their history because I was in the same profession. During the Great Depression, it did happen in North America, which is the case I studied, that professorial compensation, in other words, salaries, were cut. And cut pretty well indiscriminately, just because, a certain type of wages went down. They said, okay, the professors have to take their shares, so we cut their salary as well. And you couldn't complain to anybody. This was not a situation whereby you could assert rights or invoke contracts or promises, this or that. This was take it or leave it. If you didn't take your cut salary, then it will remain in the treasury and we'll find other beneficiaries. So this was the situation, and therefore, as I say, the problem of warehousing monetary resource. Now, I come back to the point I started to developing, which was this: selling out of your warehoused monetary metals may not be an appropriate strategy for people of small means, and the reason is a little bit complex, but we should mention at least a few aspects of it. Selling is always more technical than buying, and it's also a matter of confidence, because you may not want people to know that you are selling, because that would be a red light that there is something more where this has come from. So that's an invitation to burglars and violent people to come and steal your gold. We don't know, but there is a danger. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that the government may want to know, and of course there have been examples that the government actually confiscated the gold held by citizens, people in the United States, for example, in 1933. So the question arises, is there a possibility of warehousing which does not involve selling? Is there a strategy, a good strategy, acceptable strategy, which does not involve selling? In other words, you have an accumulation program, and is the basis still important for you if you have a strategy like this? And my answer is absolutely. If you, there are such strategies that you keep buying, add a little bit on every payday to your nest egg of gold or silver or both. And the basis is still relevant, because the basis will tell you how to time. It may not be a good idea to buy every payday, because one payday the cost of warehousing may be just too high, and then you want to wait for a better opportunity to buy. So you will fine-tune your buying to the cost of warehousing, which basically means you watch the bases, and the bases will give you the clues that this is a good time to buy now, and maybe you want to skip the next payday when you don't buy, so buy twice as much now. So all these questions come in, and you have to study the case and make the appropriate conclusion. Now, how are we doing with time?
We have 5 minutes left.
5 minutes left.
7 minutes.
And then the question. Then the question. You're right. So I want to emphasize this, that the problem is very real. It's very practical. There's no question about that. That survival, one of your most important consideration, is involved. And therefore, it should not be surprising that the answer is a little bit theoretical, because sure, the need is practical, but in order to get the best answer, you have to delve a little bit into theory. So that's what we are doing. I don't want to make it too theoretical, but I want to warn you that theory does come into it, and you have to make a conscious effort to be receptive to that theory. This theory is at the heart of the thing, and if you don't understand what you are doing, it's not a good situation, because you can easily make mistakes. So I started out with making a comparison between grain trading and grain warehousing on the one hand, and monetary metal trading and monetary metal warehousing on the other hand. And when I talked about the basis in the grain trade, I pointed out the rather obvious cyclical nature. A yearly cycle, the basis varies with the availability of warehouse space. For the monetary metals, the cyclical feature is completely absent. But there's something which takes its place, and this is very important to understand. What happens is, instead of a cycle, we have what I could call erosion of the basis, or a steady decline. It's not along a straight line, but with spikes, upward and downward spikes. It's a steady erosion over the years or over the decades. The basis started from a rather high level, which means that the Contango was historically wide. Say, when silver started trading in the futures market, this would probably, what kind of date could you put on that? Gold
65,
started much
66.
Okay. Now gold had to wait another 10 years, right?
Yeah.
Because gold was in the United States. Gold was contraband. It was not legal to own or trade gold. But you know, if you go back to the earliest, I would say you would find a Contango where the basis was rather high, and by now it has eroded to a low level, and there is no reason to assume, at least I don't see any reason to assume, that this erosion would come to an end. But what's the reason for that? The reason is the same. It's the availability of warehousing space. But of course you have to adjust this, because originally, at the beginning, the banks offered this warehousing space for gold and silver at a very, very reasonable price. And the banks became unreliable, and individuals had to provide for their own warehousing facilities, which in some cases involve something as crude as digging a hole in your own garden. But the point is that you can relate that problem in the same way to the availability of warehousing space. And at one point, as we know, there is an important crossing point, which is the basis goes from positive into negative. And in terms of contango disappears and gives rise to backwardation. And what about the end game? The end game is when backwardation is so entrenched that there's absolutely no hope for contango to come back, then it's the collapse of the monetary system. And you want to have a good indicator which gives you forewarning. Forewarned is forearmed, as the saying goes, and that's what you need. So here is the problem. I laid it out for you, and then there are lots of details which we try to fill in, but you have to really understand this, so you will want to think about this as we are going into the next session, that the basic problem is to provide for economic survival. So I stop here and invite questions.
Yes, this is our first session on the basis, which was the purpose of this, and we'll take questions for 15 minutes about this from the floor. And yes?
I just missed the grains basis bit, talking about the elevators being empty. Is that sort of just before the harvest? That's when the basis is widest?
He was asking for a clarification on the basis regarding the grain elevators, as the basis widest when they're empty. Is that what you're saying? In terms
The basis is the widest, which means the cost of warehousing is the highest. No, it's when it's full. When it's full, then any additional space is at a premium, because you approach a number of elevators and you find that they are all pretty full. So if one of them has a little space, he will definitely ask you to pay the premium for it. Now, of course, the time between the empty elevator and the full elevator is just a matter of weeks. We are at crop harvest time. The new crop is coming in, so this elevator space is filling up, and it probably doesn't take more than a month while this happens. So you have a rather steep change in the basis from the lowest basis to the highest basis in the cycle, whereas the erosion of the basis would take, say, 11 months. The opposite movement from the minimum to the top takes only a month. And that gives rise to this confusion which your question reflects, that in time we are looking at a violent change, so to speak, from the lowest to the highest basis at harvest time.
As the grain elevator is filling, the basis shoots up and then goes down.
The cost of warehousing shoots up.
Well, isn't that the same thing? Isn't that comparable?
is the cost of is the basis as the warehouse fills up? Is your basis rising or is it dropping?
It's rising.
It's rising.
Until it reaches its when the elevators are full and the new crop has been absorbed by the warehousing business, in this case the elevator business, then the basis reaches its highest level.
So you say that the future price is at the highest. If the basis is highest, then the future price must be in maximum over the current price.
No,
Not
it's
necessarily.
not necessarily. It's almost like the bond price.
You have to look
here.
at the spot price
Yeah.
and the futures price, so they kind of move
that's
like
the
this,
basis.
and then the basis is the movement like this between the two.
Between
so
the two.
you can have high futures and high spot price, and a small basis or a large basis. You can have low futures price and low spot price, and a large or a small basis. The basis is measured over time, as the professor was explaining, in the case of the grains, with the elevators becoming depleted.
Nathan?
Did I, just to clarify then, did I hear that correctly, that when you try and draw a comparison between the grain markets and the gold and silver futures markets, that the basis had been declining in the monetary metals markets gradually since the 60s and 70s because the warehouse space became more and more available because people became more and more willing to bury it in their own backyards, and therefore you had essentially unlimited storage space. Professor, is that what you were saying?
Yeah, but it's a little bit more subtle than that because the trust element of trust also comes in. The warehouse space may be there in the banks, but people are not going to take advantage of it because of the lack of trust. So this is a motivation, but if you want to work out the details, probably it takes a little long. The explanation takes a little longer.
Yes?
What should we use for measuring bases? London or fixing prices, and what futures?
It'll come the next few days. Right? Yeah, I think we're going to have the next 2 or 3 days
Yeah,
to discuss
the
that.
question is how. Yeah, I think for the purpose, how to fix the basis is, are you going to use a London fix or a New York fix or whatever? And it's very, very complex, and we're very fortunate to have Tom Zavo here.
Assume we'll be using the eBay fix as well.
Well, that's something we'd also discuss. Yeah.
Yes, Michael.
When the basis moves into backwardation, does that imply hyperinflation?
The question is when the basis moves into backwardization. Does that imply a hyperinflation?
No. These are two different. Not immediately. Now, I'm not saying that statistically in the majority of the cases it did follow, but remember the saying that post hoc ergo propter hoc, Latin. That means after this, so because of this. It's a fallacy to say that just because B happened after A, B is a consequence of A. This is one of the worst fallacies in logic. So it could be that statistically this is the way it happens. First, it goes to into permanent backwardation, the gold or silver. I would say first silver and then gold, but perhaps I'll be proven wrong on that, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, first, permanent backwardation. And by the way, what does it mean that we have permanent backwardation? What it means is the supply of gold has dried up. It doesn't mean gold disappeared. Gold is still out there, but owners of gold will not relinquish it because they do not trust that what quantity they sold they can replenish. So even the gold mines will stop selling gold because they think it's counterproductive, and that connotes or smacks like hyperinflation, but logically it's perhaps just as well to keep them separate and analyze the nuances, because there are nuances. The question is very good because it's tempting to say that, sure, permanent backwardation of gold is hyperinflation. Nobody is selling. All the offers to sell have been withdrawn.
Yeah.
But I think it's still a process. It's to identify the two is probably a
I
mistake.
suppose I'm coming from practical terms, and it relates to the question about will the end game be deflation or hyperinflation? In practical terms, does that mean that if you're holding paper, that paper is going to be valueless when backwardation occurs?
Is that what you're saying?
Well, in the sense that you will no longer
monetary
be...
system will collapse in effect,
Yeah,
right? So,
yeah,
so it'll be
yeah.
worthless. But whether it's
Yeah.
worthless because no one's using it, through
Yeah, I mean,
disuse,
the
which is
bank-
deflation,
we're just talking about
or through overuse, which is hyperinflation,
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's going to be, you know,
But it's the
gonna be
same
used
thing.
For
Right.
practical purposes to
right. Whether people
spend
just don't want to use it or because they overuse it, right? I mean, that's those are the
Yeah, it's problematical. In fact, I just want to raise something at a previous Gold Standard University session. The professor said something that just stunned me. And you had mentioned a gold corner developing in the market. That really what would happen, and this is tantamount to the backwardization, is that there would become a inadvertent gold corner. A gold corner is usually forced by manipulators in the market, cornering a commodity, holding it up, driving the price up, and reaping the benefits that way. But the professor said this would be an entirely different situation.
It could be spontaneous.
It'd be a spontaneous situation, not by the speculators, but by people refusing because of the collapse of the monetary system, holding on to their gold and silver because they didn't know what was going to happen, and in the uncertainty causing the supply to dry up into the market.
And instinctively they feel...
Like a hyperinflation.
It's in the air.
It's in the air.
It's in the air.
Yes.
I've been reading your articles where you've been saying that one day this was going to happen, it was going to go into backwardation. And that would be... Professor Fekete has been writing on the web about the possibility that the market was going to go into backwardation, and that was going to be the canary in the gold mine. And yet, the stuff that I've been reading on the web in the last few weeks say that that's actually occurred now, that the physical supply of gold bullion coins in the US, you just can't buy them. That the eBay price is much higher than the actual quoted price. That in actual fact, as we speak, do we have that occurring right now?
Okay.
I mean, they keep on coming up
yeah.
with excuses like there's no blanks and, you know, there's this and there's that. But I mean, the fact is that you cannot buy bullion in the US. That's what I've been reading on the web. Is it true? And is this occurring right now?
Yeah, he's raising the question
I
on
think
this.
we're raising a pretty complex question. We can maybe just answer it quickly here, and I don't mean to give a short shrift, but there's a difference between the retail market and wholesale market, and of course everyone says, "Oh, yeah, of course," but there truly is. And what we're seeing on the retail market is perhaps the start of what will translate to the wholesale market. And in fact, what I'll show in the next couple of days is that it may actually be happening. But the permanent backwardation is a scenario where you've gone into backwardation, you're there, and attempts to get out of it, in effect, are not successful. And the attempts to get out of it would be by obviously people that are trying to rescue the monetary system. So we would still be, even if we're moving to that, it could be 2 years, it could be 10 years, it could be 2 weeks. We just don't know. We've had periods before where this kind of thing happened. 1980, obviously that, and I'm not saying that's a comparable period, but the monetary system survived. Gold and silver did go into backwardation temporarily. There was obviously runs on retail gold, silver, bullion. So it's just, you don't know right now.
It's not just difference between retail and wholesale, but it could be difference between bullion coin and bar form, or the gold refined to various degrees.
Well, even like the American Eagles, the silver American Eagles are now selling for $6 over spot. Why? The silver Eagles, right? Yeah.
So actually, the unified gold market could split into small fragmented components, and I can even see the day coming that the gold mines use they have their own refineries, but they cannot refine to 999 fineness, right? They can probably refine to, I don't know, would you know what the gold mine does with its own...
It'd be doré bars.
Yeah.
But it's sold to a central refinery, mostly in Western Australia, in Australia.
Right. But I think what he's saying is that you would essentially pour your own gold bars on site. Doré is what that process is, and that's typically like 98% pure or something like that, 95, 98%. Yeah. Maybe some silver in there too.
Yeah. And then there's a gold dust bar market already being bandied about, that you can buy gold dust, and it has its own rules and idiosyncrasies. So this unified gold market could split into components, and that is fully to be expected, I think. And
Makes it more difficult though, figuring out which basis you're looking at, what you know, because you're going to have a multiplication of different bases. I started out 2 years ago just looking at the Kitco spot price and the COMEX futures price as a determinant, and over the last couple of years that it's just not worked. Now there's 10 different things you can look at, and probably next week it'll be 20. So
I think you have one. We have time for one more question here.
I'm fascinated by your theory on the basis, so I think it's going to be a fascinating week. But you also pointed out earlier today that gold and silver are two exceptions on the futures markets in terms of how much one can be short. And for example, China, you have obviously considered that, so your theory works even in that corrupt futures market.
would you like to?
do you want to repeat the question? Did you hear the whole question, Professor? Once you paraphrase it,
It's a big question you're asking. All right, and he's talking about the basis in regards to grain, etc. But specifically with the monetary metals, gold and silver, with such huge short positions in the market that can affect spot. He's asking, I believe you're asking the question: does the basis theory still hold in the light of such huge shorts overriding the market? Is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
Okay. Now, you will.
the theory.
The theory.
You're better at the
Yeah,
theory.
theory.
So I don't
Yeah,
want
theory.
All right.
Yeah.
First, I want to answer the question: what's the difference between a monetary commodity and a non-monetary commodity? The answer to that question is a non-monetary commodity is being consumed from hand to mouth. You never have too large a warehouse portion of this, because that would suppress the price unduly and it would hurt the producers. So there's a built-in mechanism. However, monetary metals, using the technical word, are those which have the constant marginal utility, or at least the slowest marginal utility. That's too technical. In plain language, it means that it's no longer true that the more you have, the less valuable it is. Because for copper, this is definitely true. For wheat, this is definitely true. If you have a bumper crop of wheat, then the price collapses and it may hurt the producer as much as it helps the consumer, hurts the producer. Now, for a monetary commodity, this is not the case, because the monetary commodity is being hoarded by a large number of people out there, and therefore even if production jumps, it's readily absorbed, because the existing hoards of monetary metal are big enough, and people have confidence that this additional increase will be smoothly absorbed. So in terms of the basis, what this means is that typically a monetary metal is always in contango, and backwardation is a flashing red light that something is very seriously wrong in the world. Not necessarily spelling out what it is, but it could be the monetary system, banking system, could be war or something. Whereas the case for non-monetary commodities is the basis is cyclical. It goes from contango to backwardation and back, or in any case it's cyclical. So this is the theory. Now, when it comes to practice, I will pass on the word to you.
Well, I think that, just to finish what you were saying, I think that the concept overall is that because of the large stocks to flows, it would be very difficult. I think what you're sort of implying is that there are manipulation that can essentially make the basis either paint some picture that's not true or hide the truth. But in reality, because of the large stocks of gold and silver that are out there, this is actually very difficult to do compared to a non-monetary commodity. From a practical perspective, if you view sort of the gold market as unitary, meaning everyone acts the same way, all the large players acting together could potentially, paint sort of the numbers. But I think in reality, you got to consider the profit motive, that if a particular party that has the same information as another one is looking at another party that is now trying to paint the numbers, that means that in fact they're selling at the wrong price. So the other party will come in and take advantage of that as an arbitrage, and that doing so will reset it to the same thing. And again, it all has to do with the size of the market, the underlying gold and silver that's actually out there. But again, if you think everyone's if all the bullion banks and all the central banks are all doing the same thing, and they all have the same playbook exactly every day, then potentially that could be a concern.
Tom, is that currently being done, that arbitrage?
The question, I think Tom is saying that it's possible, but you can't tell if there's any arbitrage being done in the market. It depends on who. It's done in your theory.
You can tell.
Bars and converting them into blanks and selling them on Seek Bullion or eBay.
Right. That's a very small. That is. And if it get large enough, that could, for example, affect the basis. There are tools you can use, though, to compare different. For example, one of the things I'll show is the ETFs. There's actually a mechanism by which the ETFs translate the demand for ETF shares into the physical market. Seeing how those two prices behave on a day-to-day basis at different times of the day, you can actually see the arbitrage taking place. If I were to stop seeing that happening, then I could come back and say, maybe there's something going on. But you can actually use tools to look at different prices, relationships between the different prices, and essentially establish that arbitrage is still taking place.
We're moving into backwardization on our lunch schedule. So
just say when
we'll reconvene at I believe 2:45. Is that where we're at, Maurice? Oh, okay. So 2:45, we'll take up this subject that's more interesting. What? Professor?
Now this is exceptional today because normally we'll try to keep from 2 to.
This we got shoved back. That's what it is. So we're going to try and hold to the schedule.
Tomorrow we start in the morning at 10,
At 10,
and after lunch at 2. But today is exceptional.
Yes. These are exceptional times.